All right, you probably have a little checkbox popping up asking for consent. So everyone, thank you for joining us on time or early. For some of you trendsetters ahead of this, joining us on the second webinar discussing the Pearl participatory evaluation of aging and rapamycin within longevity. I'm pretty sure I messed up a couple of those prepositions, but that's the gist of it. We have Dr. Zalzala from AgelessRx, who is the study coordinator, clinical investigator, and the founder of the telemedicine arm that's really producing the framework and capabilities to do a decentralized trial like this. And then we're also joined by Dr. Swidan from Pharmacy Solutions, who has been very instrumental helping us get up and running with being able to develop a randomized control study utilizing compounded rapamycin. We'll talk about what is compounding, what is a compounding pharmacist, why they're so important, and then talk about just rapamycin in general and kind of why it's nice to have a clinician and a pharmacist involved in you taking a product that's being used off-label in longevity. So let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Carlos Martin. I'm one of the research managers at AgelessRx, focusing on the Pearl study as well as our COVID trials. And in the future, a number of what we're going to call mini trials, utilizing our methods to focus on products not rapamycin, other ones like metformin, glutathione, NAD+, trying to figure out how many ways we can try to impact or target aging from as many mechanisms as possible. Dr. Zalzala, it'd be great if you could take the time to introduce yourself in Ageless and kind of your involvement with Pearl.
Sure. So my name is Sajad Zalzala. People call me Dr. Z for short. So I co-founded AgelessRx about 1.5 years ago, originally under the name Qualitude, but we changed the name about 1 year ago to make it a little bit more user-friendly. Qualitude was a bit nerdy, admittedly. That was my idea for a name. I started this platform because I found my passion for medicine has always been trying to find and treat the underlying cause of disease. And became more and more evident as I learned more about functional medicine, holistic medicine, that the ultimate underlying cause of almost all chronic disease is premature aging. And so that led me to the mission to try to do as much as I could to impact the aging process and help humans live longer and healthier. We currently provide telemedicine. Our telemedicine platform currently provides prescriptions such as metformin, NAD injections and patches, low-dose naltrexone, and a few other products. And as we learn more about various different products, we hope to expand that offering. The Pearl trial, the rapamycin trial, is our effort to try to bring rapamycin to the masses, so to speak. Not enough is known about rapamycin in terms of its safety or even the dosing. I mean, the dosing schedule is not even for young, healthy people or relatively young, healthy people, hasn't really been worked out. So the objective of the rapamycin trial is to work that out, study the safety, the safety profile for rapamycin, the optimal dosing for rapamycin, as well as try to figure out what biomarkers we can impact and how that will affect the hallmarks of aging.
Unmute myself. There we go.
In terms of the mini trials you speak about, I mean, we haven't really started those yet. But basically, the reason why we call them mini trials is because we have patients that come to us on metformin, who ask for metformin, LDN, NAD, things like that, and we're looking for down the line. We want to create a platform for patients to be able to input their data. Whether it's wearable data or lab work, maybe subjective type data, things like that, questionnaires, and to be able to give them a longevity score of sorts, almost like a credit score, and then help kind of customize a longevity plan for patients. And so our first step is to figure out what it is that we want to monitor and what will be impacted by various different interventions. So that's kind of another talk for another day. But stay tuned, for those of you who follow AgelessRx, stay tuned, and for our current existing patients, we'll be rolling that out, for volunteers down the line.
We kind of wear, I would say, 3 very unique hats between Dr. Swidan, Zalzala, and myself, where I'm focusing on clinical research, trying to make sure that we're trying to be better than nothing. If you have healthy participants taking drugs, we have to be better than nothing when it comes to side effects and adverse events. Dr. Zalzala wears a clinician's hat as well as the coordinator for this entire moving ship. And Dr. Swidan kind of comes at it from the actual product perspective, the mechanism that we're utilizing to try to impact change. And one of my favorite and least favorite aspects around pharmaceutical products is that they're not all the same, depending on where you source it, where you collect it, where is it created, how is it distributed. And as good of a job Dr. Zalzala and myself can do, if the product wasn't good to start with, then there was really no chance of success. So Dr. Swidan, it'd be great to let you introduce yourself and kind of speak to Pharmacy Solutions and your involvement into the Pearl study.
So nice to meet everybody. Thank you for being here. So I'm Sahar Swidan, and so I'm a pharmacist by trade. Me and Dr. Z have known each other for many moons, so I kind of teach a lot in the anti-aging functional medicine world and been in that world for 25 years. And longevity, controlling inflammation is kind of a big passion of mine, kind of like his. And really to do personalized medicine and precision medicine, which is kind of what we teach and where we met, you need compounding pharmacies, because it's really, you have to deliver the unique aspects, whether it's hormone replacement, some of these innovative treatments like low-dose naltrexone, NAD patches, and you really can't get those at your local corner drugstore, if you will. Now with drug trials, obviously it's a whole new different world and beast per se. So we have been specialists in obviously compounding. We're licensed in 45 states. We ship all over the country, which for these telemedicine platforms, they need that kind of support, but also the clinical acumen. We do a lot of clinical investigation and trials for major institutes around the country. And really, as Carlos said, I always, and Dr. Z have heard me say this from day one of life that I met him, your compounding pharmacy will make or break your clinical practice or your research study, because quality is so critical. Just like with supplements, we were talking just slightly earlier about supplements. The quality in pharmaceutical, grade and really quality supplements can make the difference between clinical efficacy and no clinical efficacy. And it's critical to really work with a compounding pharmacy that knows what they're doing, obviously with sourcing the best of ingredients, the purest, the highest in the standards, to make sure it's pharmaceutical grades. We check every chemical before it's released into circulation, but also clinical trials that really they're our own beast, because you have to be so extra meticulous in clinical trials to make sure the correct patient is getting either the sugar pill, if you will, versus the treatment arm. A lot of tracking. We have, barcodes everywhere and tracking, because it's critical, and most of the time the clinicians are blinded. So it's up to us to make sure the treatment or placebo patient is getting the correct thing, because most of the time the clinicians like Dr. Z, now he's blinded to whether it's the COVID trial that we're running for them or the Pearl trial soon. We kind of hold the key to the treatment. So it's critical to do it well, keep meticulous records, best in quality, because again, it's so critical. If we really dish out subpar, end products, a lot of times the trials will fail. And it's not necessarily because the item that you're tested or the drug or the, supplement or what have you failed. And it's not necessarily because it failed, but if the product is subpar and not the highest quality in the industry, obviously the study results will be affected, and obviously you will get less favorable to no efficacy. So that's why we work really in tandem with a lot of clinical groups like Ageless and many other even academic settings to run their clinical trials, or especially when they want to trick you, if you will, so you don't know if you're getting the sugar pill versus the placebo, where we have to use our magic to make things look exactly identical. So
I'd like to kind of ground this into forgetting about clinical trials, which is a very large onus that a pharmacy has to take on outside of their standard practice. But let's just say that this isn't a clinical trial, it's just somebody getting a therapeutic, let's say something like mental health and antipsychotic. Let's just say somebody is getting a random product outside of your pharmacy and they're getting dose modulation and higher dosages over time, and a provider switches them to a compounding pharmacy. Dr. Swidan, it'd be great to kind of hear, not horror stories, but one thing that I want to be mindful of, matching how you would produce a product versus what somebody else might be on due to quality issues. And then we can kind of relate that to rapamycin.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, obviously, if it's a commercially available medication, anybody can go to kind of, if you will, the local drugstore, and obtain those medications. Where compounding pharmacies really come in is, again, changing the dosage form. So sometimes you may be allergic to something like, let's say, red dye in a commercially available. So we're able to compound it without the red dye, or magnesium stearate, or some of these things, different. So like the low dose naltrexone, which is a great example, right? There's a lot of clinical trials that were run, but low dose naltrexone is not commercially available. Now, we heard some stories because honestly, if you go to the local drugstore and let's say the Dr. Z's of the world and many others like him, that might be prescribing that, they went to the local drugstore, and because they didn't know of that therapy, patients were getting the 50 milligram, pill. And we heard these stories over and over, and they told them to slice it into 50 pieces. And I'm like, how are you going to do that, right? To slice it in 50 pieces. So obviously the dosing was haphazard at best, and you really did not know what the patient was getting. And so that's where, some of these things, this is also the difference where, you may have been on a brand name medication, for example, and the pharmacy switched it to a generic, and by law and FDA rules, the active ingredient has to be exactly the same. But you hear this all day long from patients, right? Where the patients say, hey, it's not working the same. My blood pressure is not as controlled, or my sugars are not as controlled. And it really, that's why how you make something. So in compounding, same thing, how it's made can truly affect the outcome, because it may be the binders or fillers or something, or it's not busting in your gut, properly and dissolving so you can get that clinical effect. And this is where a lot of these clinical nuances and variability, either in dosage forms or in patient, their body differences can affect the final outcome too. And so that's where we take a lot of these clinical factors into effect. People with short gut syndromes, manipulated bowels, cancer, they can't swallow, they can't take, there's a lot of ways to manipulate that, if you will. And, low dose naltrexone is a great example. NAD, tons of research on it, again, not commercially available. So this is where we can, work the innovators of the world like Dr. Z and kind of put our brains together and come up with these kind of unique aspects of treatment and longevity, to continue to bring people into the future much better, healthier, and hopefully a much cooler, healthier version of yourself, if you will.
Yeah, and it's a huge pressure for not only a patient to figure out a choose your own adventure, find the right specialist, find the right provider, getting lucky enough to get matched to a pharmacist that is knowledgeable about all these kind of things. For Dr. Zalzala, when it comes to longevity, aging specialist, is there really a specialist like that out there? Or is it something that a provider themselves has to go out and kind of create for themselves?
There's no fellowship there's no official board certification or fellowship for longevity medicine. I suppose the closest thing would be what Dr. Swidan is involved with at the A4M, the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine, where they have training modules and things like that. But that's typically something a physician or a healthcare provider would have to go out on their own and seek out and learn. I myself, I again, there's no like official training session or recognized by the medical specialty board, for example. So a lot of physicians they read books about it. They dig deep into the biochemistry, physiology. They attend conferences. They talk to peers, and keep up to date on research. That's kind of how the field is put together right now. There is a the wind is changing, so to speak. There is more and more recognition of, for example, functional medicine as a legitimate field of medicine. It wasn't too long ago where it wasn't quite taken seriously, and I'm looking forward to the day where there might actually be an actual specialty of some sort in this field.
What is functional medicine, if I may ask?
Yeah, so functional medicine, the concept of functional medicine is digging into, you know, biochemistry and physiology to kind of find and treat the underlying cause of aging. You know, Jeffrey Bland, he does a lot of educational education on the idea of functional medicine. It differs slightly from, you know, traditional or conventional allopathic medicine, in that allopathic medicine is focused on a diagnosis, and then, you know, a treatment typically focused, the treatment is typically focused on symptomology, as opposed to, you know, functional medicine is typically, like I said, you try to dive as deep as you can into somebody's physiology, you know, and you keep asking why, you know, why does somebody have high blood pressure? Why is somebody aging prematurely? Why do they have diabetes? And you try to figure out therapies for individualized. It's almost always individualized, because what causes diabetes for one person it's not the same thing for really anybody else. It's fairly unique to that person. So that's kind of, you know, functional medicine in a nutshell. Is that?
Yes.
So where did I lose my train of thought? So hopefully one day, there'll be an actual, you know, fellowship or internship program, you know. But until then, I mean, there are a lot of physicians out there that you know, try to do what they can to keep their patients, you know, disease prevention, keep them healthier for longer. What we're trying to do at AgelessRx is roll that out, roll these types of therapies out via a telemedicine platform, and also research it. You know, a lot of times physicians who are kind of the anti-aging longevity field, they tend to have their clinics, and now there's not very much data sharing. I mean, sometimes they share data at conferences and things like that, but in terms of, like, you know, a centralized repository where you can, you know, find out what's working best and kind of iterate and improve it. Just I don't see that happening very much right now. So that's kind of what we're trying to do a little bit differently at AgelessRx.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think also, like, it's so important to really find the right clinicians, because this is a really upcoming field now, and there's been a lot of interest in it. You really want to make sure, you know, clinicians, you know, like Dr. Z, I think, you know, he's been learning, I don't know, when we met many moons ago now, we'll totally age ourselves, both of us, but you know, sometimes, you know, just be cautious. I mean, it's the same thing in pharmacy. Like, you know, you don't want to go to somebody that just went to a weekend course and now, like, they hang a shackle on their door, like, oh, we're functional medicine specialists, or I'm a, you know, anti-aging specialist, or I'm a hormone specialist. And same thing with pharmacies. I mean, I think it's really important. I think, like Dr. Z and myself and many others that do this well, you know, we've been in lifelong learning now. I've been learning anti-aging longevity medicine for the last 20, I'll age myself again, 25 years now. I've been teaching in that space. And, you know, and Dr. Z, we met many moons ago. I'll keep you younger than me per se for a minute. But, you know, it's very important when you do due diligence, you know, and find the Dr. Z's of the world, because, you know, they're not everywhere in the level of education and knowledge that's been gained through. And this is, remember, this is all postgraduate education that we're all taking upon ourselves to learn and be really the top of the field in that field, because it's not really taught in schools, as you know. And so, you know, Patrick, too, this is what's so cool, and I think has reignited our love for medicine, if you will, because it's not Band-Aid medicine, you know, where it's like symptom, drug, symptom, drug, symptom, drug. That's how we were all trained, where this really tries to find, why do you have high blood pressure or diabetes, or why is your body on fire and inflamed, or why are you aging at a much more rapid rate of degenerating, if you will, and trying to find cause, which could be a multitude of things, and kind of fix it and come up with the best solutions to really, you know, modulate, and in some cases reverse, you know, that disease, which I think is really the cool part, where we can get rid of many people's diabetes or blood pressure or autoimmune illnesses and things like that.
There's a couple of questions that have popped up into the chat. To answer Lisa's pretty quickly, if you haven't heard back, because we have been recruiting participants through the research@AgelessRx.com email, that's where the messages are coming from. If you haven't heard back from your interest or submissions to the website, go ahead and just reach out directly, and we'll get you into the pre-screening process as well. There was 2 questions before that. If someone's on this trial and they're taking other supplements, are they allowed to continue during the study? There's a couple of products that we require people not to be taking at the same time. One, if they're currently already on rapamycin or other RAPA analogs. If you are on one of those, that's not the end of the world. We actually are developing an observational cohort where you won't be in the study, but we still want to include you and provide you a route to have access to this innovative suite of diagnostics, and for us to actually get some better impact on how people are maybe trying different dosages as well. We do request that folks not be currently on metformin, as well as chronically taking oral corticosteroids or immunosuppressive medications like Humira, methotrexate, or Enbrel. But Dr. Z, is there anything from a supplement perspective that we should be cautious with in your mind?
No, we have not. We did not include any supplements in our exclusion criteria. As far as they're all fair game, as far as I know.
If you are taking one, we'd love to know.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. I mean, the reason why it's obvious why we're excluding people who are already on rapamycin, because that'll kind of taint the baseline, skew the baseline. But, metformin is thought, the reason for metformin is it's thought to be similar in some ways to rapamycin in terms of it seems to have some action on mTOR and TORC1 inhibition. So we figured for now, we'll exclude those patients. Maybe down the line, we'll be looking at combination therapies. So once we finish Pearl and we expand Pearl, then we'd be looking at rapamycin with metformin, rapamycin with NAD, perhaps start getting into senolytics and things like that. Various different supplements. There's a lot of natural products. Just because it's natural doesn't necessarily mean it's not potent. And just because it's pharmaceutical doesn't mean it is potent or effective. So there's a lot, there's a lot of things we'd like to do, and this is kind of will help us build a foundation to start doing that.
Thank you. This is Patsy. So my question was pretty much, I'm thinking of my normal like B vitamins and things like that and such like that. So I thank you for answering my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody who is a longevity enthusiast will be on supplements.
Yeah.
So yeah, supplements are fair game. Like I said, just for now, metformin and rapamycin, we're not including.
And I think in that case, you would also want someone not to be taking like berberine or berberine.
Berberine is a little bit of a different story. We have not specifically excluded berberine.
Okay.
It is similar in some ways to metformin, but not identical. So I think berberine would be okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Patsy, for putting that into the chat as well. Dr. Swidan, there's a question where you had a reference, I believe, the bioequivalents and generic versions of meds not being as effective. How does this apply to rapamycin, which is an older product? We're sourcing it and compounding it ourselves. How does it compare to rapamycin, and is the generic as effective in your mind?
Yeah, so just to clarify again, what I was saying is not necessarily the generics are not effective. What I was trying to make the point is at times when you're switched from, let's say, a brand to a generic, you may not get the same exact effect. But remember, the active ingredient is really the same. So by FDA rules, the active ingredient in the brand name, let's say metformin versus the generic metformin has to be the same. Sometimes people may not get the same effect, not because the active ingredient is bad, if you will, or different. It's because sometimes the fillers and binders and other things that they've used, or the dissolution, so now because it's different binders, fillers, or release mechanism than the brand name, if it was a longer lasting type pill, you may not get the same clinical effect. But by law and by FDA rules, the active ingredient has to be the same. So for rapamycin, as you guys know, that was available drug and it was used as an immunosuppressant in the olden days per se, but more recently kind of fell out of favor because, newer drugs always come into play and people use those. But with this now, how it's available is really, through compounding or through a generic. And again, there's tons of generics on the market and they work beautifully. But what I was trying to make is if it doesn't work for you exactly like either another generic or the brand name, look into the ingredients, the fillers, the binders, because they could be just interacting differently with your body. And sometimes switching even from one generic to the next can make a huge difference, or switching from the brand to the name. And that's why it's important. You can get all kinds of quality of what we call raw materials or powders. And that's why, you have to make sure the place that you work with, they're obtaining pharmaceutical grade, powders, they get the certificate of analysis, look at it, make sure the potency is within the USP guidelines, and that it's pharmaceutical grade, and also, potent, but also clean from a lot of the contaminants and other things that you don't want in your powder.
Just to be clear,
that was my question, Dr. Swidan. But can you help me bring it to a real simple level, because I just don't understand. So let's just hypothetically, let's say I have a prescription for rapamycin,
Right.
and I bring it to a CVS. I could bring it to a compounding pharmacy. I don't really understand what a compounding pharmacy is, and they could fill the same prescription. Tell me how it works.
Absolutely. So if it's like, let's say, a generic or a brand name that is commercially available, you could go to CVS and Walgreens or whatever, Rite Aids, whatever's your local corner drugstore, as I call it, right? So absolutely, you can go in and get those from any of those pharmacies, whether it's brand or a generic drug that's available commercially. Where compounding pharmacies come in, for example, low-dose naltrexone. Now, this is a new treatment that's kind of popping up in the literature. You really can't go to CVS and Walgreens and get low-dose naltrexone. You would have to come to a specialty compounding pharmacy that basically we buy all the ingredients from scratch and we make the cake, if you will. So in the olden days, all medications were compounded. Basically the pharmacist kind of got the raw ingredients to make the cake, and they baked, whether it was, the pill for your cholesterol or sugar pills or whatever. Now, because of the advent of commercially and generic and commercially available drugs, obviously that's no longer the majority, but compounding comes in. So let's say if you take rapamycin to CVS, absolutely they can fill the generic. But if the generic that's available, let's say it's only available and it has red dye number 5, and you're allergic to red dye number 5, for example, you can bring it to a compounding pharmacy and they can make it from scratch for you without red dye number 5, for example.
The other point is, so the reason why we're compounding the rapamycin is not because it's not available generically. I mean, if you can go to CVS or one of the other commercial pharmacies, it typically comes in, 0.5 milligram, 1 milligram, 2 milligram tablets. So that's what it's commercially available in. However, in order moving forward in terms of the dosing that we think will be beneficial for longevity, we're trying 4 different dosing regimens, and the only way to practically speaking, the only way to kind of get that is through compounding. For example, 10 milligrams, for example, once a week, you'd have to take five of the generic tablets in order to achieve that. Or we can compound it for you for one tablet containing 10 milligrams or capsule.
There's also the fact that you're running a blind study and everybody would know what they're on.
Also, exactly,
yes,
the blind.
Yeah. So the purpose of the ultimate purpose of our study, like I said, is there's strong enough data to indicate that rapamycin should work in humans. It's worked in every organism in terms of extending life. Every organism that's been tested in. So there's no reason to think it doesn't work in humans. The question is, what dose? We don't really know yet. There's some speculation, 5 milligrams, 6, 10 once a week, but we're not sure if that's the optimal dose. And so so given that our ultimate purpose is to roll it out, kind of on our telemedicine platform eventually. It might take us a few years. We wanted to kind of do the study such that it'll mimic what we're going to be plan to be doing down the line when we start offering it through our telemedicine platform, and that would be through a compounding pharmacy.
Now, a question, sir.
Sure.
You noted that a lot of the problems that have to do with the longevity industry, if you will, is that people don't share data a lot. Do you intend to publish your results?
Yeah, part of our mission, we have we're a public benefit corporation, and we're mission driven in terms of helping advance the field of longevity. We'll make the results available to whoever wants to request them.
Beyond the results, we're actually producing what's called a biobank. As part of the study is that we're collecting patient samples And beyond the general consent procedure to get somebody enrolled into the study, there's an optional section where participants can elect to let other researchers utilize that biobank for their own studies, because we'll have patients that are on control, patients that are actually taking rapamycin in different dosages. And it's really interesting, very valuable physical product beyond the data itself that we're opening to researchers who have to submit a very dedicated research protocol and get it approved ethically to be available. So beyond just the data, which is valuable, even the patient material that we're collecting that we don't use for our own study will be available for other researchers to kind of make it this open resource platform that I think the next question is going to answer into about cost to participate. So Dr. Z, in my mind, since this is, funded by AgelessRx, funded by the crowdfunding campaign that's coming up pretty soon, and funded by participants, I mean, it only seems natural that this really should be open source, open data, open access to what we're producing in here, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I said, that was kind of our mission from day one. And that's why we have so many potential collaboration partners that we've been working with. Carla had mentioned, banking blood, and the idea of that is, maybe 6 months, 12 months from now, there's a university, for example, that has biomarkers that are unique or that that are better at predicting age, for example. We could work with that university or lab to provide samples to see how rapamycin affects those particular biomarkers. In terms of the cost, Carla, did you want to cover that?
Yeah.
The logistics there?
The cost to participate is, once you've been determined to be eligible to enroll for the study, it's a 3-month deposit of $360. And then continued participation is a monthly cost of $120. And that fund is dedicated to cover the cost of the testing, covering the mobile phlebotomist to actually go collect blood samples, because this is a decentralized trial. So you don't really have to leave your home for most of the study. For the body composition scan, which is, Dr. Z, the only in-person visit in my mind that a person has to actually contribute to as well. So that's kind of the cost to participate. So hopefully that answers your question, beyond your time committing to that as well, and consenting to the study itself.
Was that $120? Was that per month?
Correct, with the first 3 months needing to be as a deposit. Since Dr. Swidan, if I remember correctly, we're shipping 3-month supplies of rapamycin to the participants, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, the way, I mean, it's difficult to fund these types of trials because the government doesn't, the FDA doesn't really recognize aging as a disease, so they don't really put very many funds towards it, and there's usually a lot of hoops and red tape to jump through. I mean, just look at Nir Barzilai with the TAME trial and how much, how well, I don't want to use the word slow. I mean, it's steady. It's probably the better word, because he's trying to, collect funds from here and there. So we've come up with a really unique way of helping fund these trials. So part of it will be from AgelessRx. We'll actually be purchasing the medications for the patient. And the patient participation portion of it, it has to go to the testing and the biobanking. But where the crowdfunding campaign will come in is the testing that will be covered by $120 a month will only be mostly the safety and baseline testing. What we really need, is to look at all those fancy biomarkers that have come out, the methylation test, the microbiome test, looking at the mTOR pathways, proteomics, things like that. So that's where the crowdfunding campaign will be key, and that's set to launch through life extension, through LEAF. That's set to launch very soon, hopefully the next couple weeks. And the idea is any funds that we receive from the crowdfunding campaign will go towards some of these, for lack of a better term, fancier analyses and tests. Take, for example, a methylation test, the epigenetic test, commonly known as the Horvath clock and tests. Steve Horvath, Professor Horvath at UCLA is kind of the father of these methylation clocks. the analysis, to run the test and things like it is about $250 to $300 per sample. So if you multiply that over about 400 samples twice or 3 times, you can see how that quickly adds up. So that's how the fundraising campaign funds will be used. So by structuring it this way, it allows us to be able to get this study off the ground in a very economical way, but also in almost record time compared to what would be done at a pharmaceutical company or an academic lab.
There were a couple of questions that came in around enrollment and exclusionary criteria. I went ahead and provided a link to the clinicaltrials.gov that goes through it in a bit more of exhaustive detail. But during the enrollment, we'll kind of be screening participants during the consent procedures. For type 1 diabetes, we do have that as a exclusion criteria, as well as anyone with poorly controlled diabetes with A1C level of above 7% or insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes. Just to clarify again from a private message that anyone who is on metformin is capable of being enrolled in the study, but they do have to discontinue use of metformin throughout the entire year-long study. So just keep in mind that Rapamycin Pearl is kind of the front-running larger study that we're producing, but we have a bunch of mini trials that we're developing peripherally to this study that folks might be eligible for as well. If you have any other questions about being accepted into the study, it's similar to my response to Lisa. Anyone who has submitted a pre-screen form, which you followed up with, should have received a capability to meet with a clinical coordinator or at least to schedule an invite. Some folks mentioned that the email came into their, what do you call it? Spam promotional folders. So check over there. And if you don't see it or just want to reach out to us directly, we can check in our system to see where you are in the enrollment process, or if you've not been getting the emails as well. So it'll be coming from research@AgelessRx as well. So that should answer, Kevin, your question about being notified and accepted. Brooke Norton asked, go ahead.
Don Latham, sorry, I'm one of the ones that asked one of those questions, so I just wanted a quick follow-up. If I'm on metformin, I discontinue it to participate in the trial, should I have challenges with my blood sugar and decide I have to withdraw? What are the impacts of that? Or do you not, if you think there's an issue there, because it's well controlled, but nonetheless, I've been using it for quite some time and haven't been off of it. So thoughts on that?
Dr. Z, I'd love to punt the clinical question.
Yeah, that's a good question. So so if I understand the question, if we have a type 2 diabetic and we're well controlled on metformin, I guess if I understand the question properly, if we ask them to stop the metformin, they may no longer be well controlled on the diabetes. Is that what you're implying?
Yeah, essentially, I use diet, metformin, and exercise to keep my A1C down around 6. But should I go off metformin? It's been years since I have been off metformin, so I don't know if my A1C would pop up higher.
Sure.
Yeah,
that's definitely a case we haven't encountered yet. With rapamycin, part of the dosing, I mean, talking about rapamycin in general, part of the trick to the dosing is that if you dose it too high, you actually start having insulin resistance. But if you dose it properly, you actually start having the opposite, and it could reduce visceral fat. I don't have enough data to say whether or not it's going to help control blood sugar or not. It would have to be something we'd have to look at on an individual basis.
Well, my thesis is that the reduction in visceral fat would help with the insulin resistance to the point that it could compensate. But that's a thesis. We don't know.
Yeah, the question is, meantime, like how much of an A1C increase would we see? Because it's not, the reduction of visceral fat is not going to happen overnight. So it's possible we could see an increase in A1C, and it could potentially, if somebody is diabetic on metformin, we ask them to stop it. it is possible that we could see, you know, an increase in A1C because of the stopping of the metformin. It's something we'd have to consider on a case-by-case basis.
And my idea too is that I would probably just get more resilient in a lower carb type diet to try to pull that down a little bit. Do you see any impact of being in a ketogenic state, ketosis state through this, or is that an issue?
Well, we don't want people making too many changes when they enroll, because that would skew the results. So if you start, do the baseline trials and then you change your lifestyle drastically, we wouldn't know whether it's the rapamycin or the lifestyle changes. So we would typically ask people. I mean, we obviously won't discourage anybody from adopting a healthier lifestyle, but we don't want anybody doing any extreme lifestyle changes during the trial because, like I said, we wouldn't know. Is it the rapamycin that's improving the A1C or visceral fat, or is it something else? So typically, I mean, in an ideal situation, we would have people continue to do what they're doing, get their baseline, put them on rapamycin, and then compare the rapamycin group with the control group.
Right.
But if somebody had, metformin drops A1C by about 1, maybe 1.5%. So if somebody, is really well controlled on metformin, it probably wouldn't cause A1C to jump, from let's say 6 to 8, for example, if you stop it. So I think, like I said, it would depend case by case. We would have to consider, look at the history of the blood work, things like that before we consider enrolling. But that's actually a very good question. Thanks for bringing that up. Thanks
for the thoughtful answer. Appreciate it.
And that's one of the major reasons why we're so penchant on the safety testing for folks at baseline as well as month 1 of the study and continuing throughout to make sure that we're monitoring those issues to figure out should somebody maintain participation in the study itself, since we're trying to be safety first and then the outcomes, which are why the study is designed. Dr. Swidan, I'd like to maybe tag team this question from Brooke around rapamycin working the same pathway as fasting and exercise, and thinking about, does rapamycin add any additional benefits? And this kind of touches into pharmacogenomics, but just kind of coming from your perspective of pharmacists, how much of an impact lifestyle changes has that could be complemented or supplemented with a pharmaceutical product at the same time.
Yeah, I'll start, then I'll have Dr. Z kind of add to it. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This world and this science is evolving. I mean, I was just on a call even earlier with genetics and transcriptomics now, because it is so much. So your genetics, and we used to think, okay, that was your destiny, that's it. And now we're finding out really it's a very small part of your destiny. And now it's more about epigenetics and how you interact with the world, if you will, and then how that world turns your genes on and off, and also translationally. So for example, like methylation, you hear a lot about methylation lately. And just because you have a genetic hiccup in your methylation, when we go to test you, like and sometimes get biomarkers like a homocysteine or the Horvath genetic methylation clock and things like that, sometimes you find out, well, the body has adapted. Even though you have bad sucky genes per se, your body has figured out workarounds, if you will, where it continues to work in a proper fashion. So is there other ways to modify and increase longevity? And is mTOR the only pathway? Absolutely not. Definitely, we know, sleeping well, reduce stress, exercise, intermittent fasting, Dr. Walter Longo, I have the pleasure of lecturing with all the time, on intermittent fasting and the keto diets, which diets, all the stuff absolutely plays into a role. Now, and that's what we're trying to understand. Is the mTOR regulation, is fasting, we know, can help that and help many other things, not just the mTOR, exercise. But what we're trying to learn, for example, with rapamycin is, to what level does it dock the mTOR pathway? Is it bigger or smaller than the effects of exercise, sleeping, fasting, all this good stuff that we all should be doing, and is there a more dose-related clinical effect also from modulating mTOR pathway, even cellular division, right? Because we know rapamycin was used in a variety of different cancers and things like that, because we know it modifies even, the proliferation or just like how your cells divide pathways. And so this is where this science comes in, Can rapamycin add to that? Absolutely. But that's what we're trying to find. Can it add to it? What is the sweet dose or the right dose that does that? And is there a variability between individual variability? This is the beauty of personalized medicine. You may only need 2.5 milligrams, for example, of rapamycin to dock your mTOR pathway, if you will. Somebody else may need 0.5 milligram. And this is what it's going to show us, the dose response relationship, the more patients we have, and look at these trends to see how is it faring in addition to the good stuff that you're already doing in your lifestyle.
And it's one of those things that exercise and fasting is very difficult for so many folks to be able to commit to comprehensively. And not that we're advocating people start and stop rapamycin throughout the entire time, but it's always nice to have a toolkit that can be personalized, that can kind of match people during their aging progression, or being able to put aging into stasis, maybe even being able to maintain exercise and fasting at the same rate people are doing beforehand. So it's always, I think, behavioral modification usually has a much larger impact than drugs ever can, additive over time. But there's always a nice way to complement these things together. Dr. Z? I
always say it's layers. I mean, you eat well, you stay physically active, you do intermittent fasting. I definitely view things like metformin, NAD supplementation, all the therapies that we're going to provide are just extra layers of protection. I think the question was specifically, I mean, like, if you're perfect on your fasting and you're in perfect physical condition because of physical activity, how much more benefit with things like metformin and rapamycin? We're not quite sure, actually, to be quite honest. There's reason to believe that there's reason to believe that it could be beneficial. Reason to believe that it may not add any additional benefits. We don't know yet. Hopefully, it's something we can study down the line. But take exercise, for example. We don't know what the optimal dose is yet. Even diet. I mean, there's probably not a one-size-fits-all diet for all humans. I think there's a lot of variability there. So I think, in an ideal world, if you're doing everything perfectly, you may not necessarily need rapamycin, metformin, et cetera, but I think realistically, it for all the rest of us, 99% of people who don't do things perfectly, we probably all need these extra layer of protections to give us the best chance of warding off age-related diseases.
And I think the other thing, the important, even, and unfortunately we see this, even in people where you think, God, they're doing everything perfectly, and what happened? And I can give you example after example that will shock you. I think two things. One is, we live in such a toxic world. So just our cells are being exposed to so much more garbage, if you will, in toxins, where it needs a lot more, utility and tools, if you will, to really keep your cells healthy. And so that's important. I think stress also is playing such a huge role, because we know kind of we always said stress is bad for you. But now we even really understand at the microRNA level why stress is bad for you. And I think, and also our nutrition is very different nowadays. So even, I'm a toxin nut job, organic, never fed my kids a jar in their life, all that stuff that we all think like, and you make your green and juices and blah, 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 right? But the problem is, even the nutritional value of good food is very different. And they did studies, which was really cool. Like, the nutritional value of an orange today was so different than 50 years ago. So when you add all this stuff where our food is less nutritious, toxins, even in exercise, eating well, sleeping, fasting, toxins that are hitting us really at the cellular level, we all need support. And you need these things with Ageless, if you will, whether it's the glutathione to kind of help your detox pathways, and metformin to dock these, and other supplements that we're looking at. This is why it's kind of bad when me and Dr. Z get together, because we go off on a million tangents of what we want to study. But, the main point is, with just doing these basics, which we always knew, good food, exercise, sleep well, less stress. Nowadays, it's not enough. And we know we need the NAD for that mitochondrial recharge to really keep our cells at optimal levels, because we're just hit with a lot more than people were hit with, honestly, 50, 100 years ago from environmental load.
One of the other things we want to accomplish with this study is we want to, like I mentioned before in the introduction, personalize somebody's longevity plan. You know, we're hoping that we'd be able to measure somebody's mTOR activity and see, like, you know, that would be the ultimate way, you know, of the future is, you know, let's say you're doing everything 100% perfect. Let's measure mTOR activity, for example. See, is it where it should be? Would you benefit from from either metformin or rapamycin? You know, maybe it's just a notch too high and we want to knock it down just a little notch. Maybe you just need a little bit of rapamycin. We're not there yet, but that's our goal. You know, we have to start somewhere, obviously. So, you know, I wish I could wave my magic wand and and figure out all the pieces to this puzzle. But unfortunately, you know, we have to start step by step. And for us, this Pearl trial and all the biomarkers we're going to be measuring and things like that.
So that's why I'm here tonight. Is seems like this study is addressing all these things that will be so good to know. So.
Exactly. I mean, it's not going to give us all the answers. You know, it's not going to give us all the answers, but it's going to answer. We're hoping it'll answer a lot of the important questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and it's so critical. And I mean, I think, you know, that's honestly what I'm very academic at heart. You know, I have many books, publications, all that stuff, you know, and I think what always drives us nuts and still drives us nuts in this field is we're doing such good medicine, if you will. You know, people were reversing disease, people are improving, you know, feeling the best that they have. But, you know, when we go to our usual medical journals, we don't find these clinical trials that everybody reports on a daily basis. And I think that's why, you know, kudos to Ageless, if you will, for taking this on. Very little groups are taking this on to study these differences, because exactly, we do need these studies to better answer your questions, and clinicians and know that there's just a few pioneers, you know, a few pies in the skies like Dr. Z and few others that are, even today I was talking to a colleague and he's doing such cool stuff in his lab, you know, looking at hormones and the levels in estrogen receptors and how they dock cytokines. How cool, like one patient at a time, and they're seeing the effect. So this is exactly why we want to do the science and continue, and we must do this science because we need to study this so we can honestly better answer the clinician questions and the patient questions. You know, what's the dose? What is it good for me? Is it going to help me with my diabetes or blood pressure? What's the right dose? If I exercise and eat good, do I still need this? This is what's really missing in this kind of forward medicine, as I call it. You know, not a lot of the data yet. And this is why it's so critical to gather this data.
If I could also take a preference to get a healthy person doing all the things right, that's a very interesting participant to be able to test this and to see if there's an upper limit. But I do want to dive into the word, would I have any benefit? And not to say that there's an economical benefit, but we are getting some research grade testing diagnostics that are being conducted at a research grade level as opposed to paying for it out of pocket commercially. And then from that, it's kind of like similar to buy this coupon book and get this discount later. So we are getting a very decent rate for some of these research tests that are very difficult to get access to, that you yourself will get your results back and then be able to compare it to the results when it's published to see kind of where you fall along the line at the same time, which I think is quite valuable for anyone that's an enthusiast in the longevity community as well. We're about the last 5 minutes. We have a question that touches on products that people are taking. I can go through the exclusion. It's taking corticosteroids, things like methotrexate, Enbrel, Humira would be an exclusion criteria, and being on metformin. When it comes to bioidentical hormones or supplements, it'd be great to know what you currently are on, just to make sure that we're very cognizant of being monitoring and thinking about any interactions that we might surface through the diagnostics that we provide during the test itself. So Aria, hopefully that answers your question.
I think I addressed that earlier. We're not excluding any. We're trying to limit the exclusions to as many reasonable things as possible. Realizing that people in the longevity community are, you know, a lot of them are taking supplements and bioidentical hormones, things like that, which, by the way, down the line, we're hoping to study, you know, potentially hormone optimization, nutrient optimization, things like that. Rapamycin, like I said, is this Pearl trial is the first step to start creating the research infrastructure to look at combinations, to look at all these other promising therapies that are out there.
This is what would be considered a clinical control study, but getting to the portion where we are using less and less exclusion criteria gives it the capacity to be a real world data study at the same time, where this is how actually the products will be utilized in the real world settings. The biggest difficulty is that this is a decentralized trial where we have very little touch point with participants over a year-long study. So some of these exclusions are safety driven. And it'd be great, Dr. Z, in a couple, well, after the study, if we actually had clinical sites that are a bit closer to home, that we might actually be able to enroll folks that aren't just always decentralized. So maybe we can actually try it in these smaller subpopulations to see these drug interactions.
Well, that can cut both ways, because there was actually our PI, Dr. James Watson. He did a small scale rapamycin trial in the Los Angeles area, and it happened to coincide with large forest fires. And so, you know, he was wondering, he hasn't published his data yet, because I think they're still waiting back for some specialized testing. But there's always that nag in the back of his head: how much did these forest fires, you know, affect the results? Because you can imagine all that smog and pollution and things like that could have accelerated aging and threw off the results. So I mean, part of the reason for the decentralized approach is, you know, to mimic real life, you know. In the future, hopefully, we can prescribe rapamycin through our telemedicine platform, and it will be a decentralized. So we kind of need to know what to look out for and things like that when we do it. I mean, it's not going to be completely touch point free. I mean, patients will be asked to check in. I mean, they'll have access to our clinical coordinators if there's any side effects. You know, we'll be chasing people down and making sure they get their tests done. You know, and then initially they'll be, you know, we're asking everybody to see a physician. You know, typically their primary care physician for almost like a sports physical type of thing, just to kind of make sure, you know, we kind of have boots on the ground, so to speak, to sign off that this patient's healthy enough to, you know, participants healthy enough to participate. Like Carlos says, I mean, we, you know, down the line, we may look at rapamycin for, you know, cognitive impairment and cancer prevention, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, you know, the focus is on relative, you know, otherwise healthy individuals without any major comorbid conditions.
Well, I think we're getting close to the end of the hour-long time frame that we put aside to this. Dr. Swidan, is there anything that you kind of want to, last thoughts or anything that you want to kind of touch on that you think folks should know about who are joining a study at this size, at the scale that is kind of a bit of a unique structure in your mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, this is nice. It's kind of one of the larger trials that we're, you know, conducting right now, and really, you know, according to academic standards. So it's very well designed, very well thought of. There's a lot of touch points and a lot of, you know, monitoring that we will be doing from the drug side, and obviously they will be doing from the patient side and stuff. And I think it'll be really interesting. We're all looking forward to this because it's a lot of questions that we really want to see the results. And I think, you know, like Dr. Z said, and Carlo, you know, like people on bioidenticals, NAD, I think, you know, it's going to be really interesting when we even do the sub-analyses of like, oh, do we see different results in people on bioidentical hormones with the mTOR suppression and that kind of things. But I think, you know, again, it's critical that you always work with clinicians that know what they're doing in the anti-aging world, in, you know, clinical research, and really with pharmacies. And obviously, you know, Carlo, on the other side, we work on a lot of and discussing a lot of other, you know, unique opportunities too. But it's very important that you have this collective team that really knows how to run the clinical trials, from executing the trial to clinical to the front end.
Thank you so much. And then we're at the last kind of minute, but Dr. Z, anything you want to kind of end on?
Oh, I was just saying, I mean, one thing I think we didn't touch on is, even though we're going to be compounding it, I mean, Dr. Swidan is, you know, been compounding for a long time, and she really knows what she's doing with it. That's why I selected her pharmacy. But I mean, it's going to undergo testing and potency testing and, you know, batch testing and things like that to ensure that we get the right dose for patients. So even though it's not going to be a commercially available product, but it is going to be a very well-controlled product that we're going to be offering to patients.
Well, I think that's the last moment we have. So,
okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Carlo, for arranging this. Thanks,
Yeah.
Dr. Swidan, for coming on. And feel free to share the recording of this with your family and friends when it comes out. And for those of you who haven't heard back from us, apologies to those we haven't gotten back to yet. We've been very busy putting all the pieces together to make sure we get this trial started properly. Thank you very much, and everybody have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
everyone.
Hey,
Bye.